We've had an election, fellas, and elections have consequences. And politicians often claim a mandate. Is it different this time when Donald Trump claims a mandate, or is this just another politician saying I got a mandate? Because I remember a lot of mandates. I mean, Biden had a mandate, Trump had a mandate, Bush had a mandate. All these people had mandates, but I didn't always see that mandate follow through.
I guess I'm on the big screen here. We're all pretty equal.
Yeah.
So I think Trump's got a pretty strong mandate. Trump won in a landslide for a Republican. I mean, the way the country's structured right now, obviously, I mean, you have most mega cities vote Democratic. You got a mix of living and dead people of all ethnic varieties in that voter pool. So the Republicans usually lose the popular vote by 1% or 2%. Popular vote doesn't matter that much. Trump won the popular vote by about 2%. They're still trying to dig up votes in some states, but that hasn't been too successful. Trump won the Electoral College, got over 300 votes. So I think there actually is a pretty sweeping base of support. The majority of the population voted for Trump's policies. And last thing, but it was actually a really diverse electorate for Trump as well. I mean, he won Native Americans 65-35. The big guy won. I think it was 30% of black men. Hispanics was like 45-55. So people keep trying to present this as, all you white guys out there, although I'm not white. Not there's anything wrong with that. But like all you white guys out there went out, in your jackets and voted for Trump. But that's not really what happened. I mean, except for isolated groups like college-educated black women, I mean, Trump took huge chunks of every population. So when he says things like we're tired of DEI, or I think the trans issue is a big winner for Trump. When he says we're sick of some of this stuff that's been going on under Biden, losing negotiations with these little countries, I think there's a mandate behind that, definitely.
Yeah, I would add to that to echo Will that the Black, Hispanic, and youth vote in particular on a Republican platform, particularly a Republican platform that, unlike his predecessors, is not an establishment position, right? When we've had establishment Democrats and Republicans, the back and forth has still created the growth of the state, and what comes to mind there is New Deal era, Great Society era, Patriot Act era. Those are Democrat and Republican eras that increased the state. And we have a figure in Trump who is promising reform in an efficiency quest, right? In knocking down some of the institutions that have become pathological in place, and put in place a more efficient and less intrusive set of policies.
Yeah, and I think that's just as a quick comment. I think that when people talk about thinking outside the box, that's kind of what that means. Like, there's not an inherent set of things in most situations that you have to do, and people tend to forget this. I often phrase this when I do business consulting and so on as rules aren't real. And my Catholic or martial arts buddies or so on would prefer rules aren't ultimate in most cases or something. When you look at a government that has, all this stuff, a Department of DEI, let's say, it's more complicated than that. You have the Justice Department Civil Rights Office. The assumption is that changes are going to be made within the framework of the Justice Department Civil Rights Office. But there's no inherent reason you couldn't just say, well, we didn't have that 50 years ago. The government spent most of its money on the troops, foreign diplomacy, and building roads. We could easily go back to that or to something else. And I think that's Trump's attitude. I mean, one of the things he did when he went in was repeal Executive Order 11252, I believe, 256, which was Lyndon Johnson's kind of tricky way of sneaking affirmative action to the government bureaucracy. Like, the government wouldn't do business with business players that wouldn't do diversity forward shit. And Trump has a good lawyer on his team, probably one of Stephen Miller's guys, and was just like, we could get rid of this and we could topple probably 70% of affirmative action in the federal bureaucracy. And there's no reason a leader couldn't do stuff like that pretty consistently. Like, you don't like this department? Afuera.
Afuera. Yes.
So let's, yes, this is great. And then one of the mistakes of the Johnson administration was you relied on an EO for now 60 plus years. And is Trump going to fall into the same trap? Are we going to get some of this stuff codified? He has the House and the Senate right now. Maybe it takes a little more to get the Democrats to give him enough to get over the top. But EOs are one thing, but that's decree. That's not law.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
So yeah, go ahead, Will.
oh yeah, okay. The executive orders are not ideal, definitely. The problem with EOs, which I think all of you guys know, is that so this is like what happened with Trump the first time, right? Like I mean, I usually vote Republican. I think Trump had a pretty good presidency, but when he stepped down, he had all this stuff done, like continue building the border wall at a glacial pace, but it's going up, and that was all done by the president. Obama did this too because he was facing a tough Republican Senate. I'm going to govern with a pen and a phone. The issue is that when the next guy gets into power, all they have to do is literally with a pen strike through your EOs. Like this doesn't apply anymore. This is the Joe Biden administration. And then you write your 200 executive orders. So the risk with what Trump is doing right now is, if someone like Gavin Newsom or Kamala Harris got back in power, they could literally just reopen all the DEI offices in the government and rehire all of those people who would just be consultants for Fortune 1000 companies. And then, I mean, they're probably going to be in power for 8 years. And you see that cycle just go back and forth. Yeah, you want Congress to do its job. All law, we sometimes forget now, we've all worked with the government, but all law is supposed to come from Congress. Not weird regulatory agencies like the Bureau of Theoretical Energy Research, not the president sitting on an ass with his Eastern European wife giving him advice, writing, punishing his opponents. It's supposed to, the Congress is supposed to do almost everything. And that hasn't been the case for a really long time. Can Trump get back to that? I don't know. A big problem is the filibuster in the Senate. So you need 60 votes to do anything. And when was the last time you saw one party get 60 votes?
Yeah, that's going to be the issue. I view the initial wave of executive orders as, an undoing of the status quo in the short term, but that acts like placing your finger on the slip knot before you tie the bow. You're going to eventually have to put a bow of law on that to have any long-term effect there. But I do think that it's important in the sense that, like, we haven't had a healthy left and right wing dynamic in the U.S. for most of my lifetime, I would submit. And, I think that's a very important function in the Jordan Peterson sense of having a right wing that defends the things that got us to our current position, that defends the status quo, the experiments that work, which traditions are experiments that work, but having a left wing that is going to bring innovation and also adaptation as reality shifts and changes over time is an important function. And when that's not working, I see Trump incorporating a Tulsi Gabbard and an RFK as an attempt to kind of homebrew that within his own ecosystem, because you're going to have some center left thought within that dynamic that's going to be important to moving the country forward. And I think that as those dynamics play out publicly, the general public might see that's a functional left and right happening within the Trump ecosystem.
When we look at the beginning of the Biden administration, similar actions, right? EOs like crazy. We're going to remove things. We're going to put these things on day one, right? Here we go. So how would this, apart from it being like our team, their team, whatever kind of thing, like administratively, how is this any different?
I think Trump is willing to completely demolish some of the agencies under his executive branch. And that's atypical. Most executives want to grow their administrations, and I see Trump, who is entertaining the IRS and the income tax in his sights, as a radical change.
Well,
yeah, I think that's a good point. What you've seen over the past, so this actually gets into some kind of core political science. Like what you've seen over the past really 150 years is the massive growth of the executive branch. I mean, when you talk about the cabinet, you're really just talking about the heads of the executive administrative agencies, right? So when the country began, there were like three of them. There's, peace or state, there's war or defense, and there's the treasury and the mint. And that's gradually gone up to the point now where you have agriculture and commerce and veterans affairs and all this other stuff. So in general, Congress has tried to avoid as much of the lawmaking responsibility as possible and pass that on to the president so they can focus on chasing women in DC and paying themselves, which is the one thing they do every year, and passing the budget, frankly. So presidents have in general liked this because you've gotten to kind of the imperial presidency where the president is the boss man. He's in charge of all these agencies. Trump, I think, already saw himself as a boss. He already runs $1 billion company. I mean, I don't mean to kiss his ass, but he doesn't necessarily care about every trapping of power in DC. So yeah, he'd be willing to get rid of some of this stuff. The problem is that it's really hard to do. Like, most agencies are funded for 10 years or funded for long periods going forward. I mean, you've got appropriations, assessments. There are different ways in which things are funded. If he gets rid of one major government agency, I mean, that would be pretty significant in the USA. Let's see if he does.
Yeah, that whole thing, like a lot of our politics works on budget, and the budget is secured in such a way to protect certain things from attacks like these, because we tend to bang around every 48 years and change our minds on stuff. When we talk about bringing in former Democrats like RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, we're seeing Trump willing to put people into office who you wouldn't normally see an executive put in. And also a dude like Hegseth and the other nominees, you're like, oh, I'm uncomfortable with this person's level of experience. But we also saw Leon Panetta run CIA and the military in general. Look, I couldn't say anything intelligent about the DNIs. Like, I couldn't compare and contrast all 11 of them. Or I couldn't even name all of them. And when I was out collecting on the ground, I could give a fuck who the DNI was. Right. It had zero bearing. They couldn't even put their finger on me and make me do something. We're so distant, right? So do I even care who the DNI is? Do I even care who the undersecretary of whatever is? I don't know. But what are your guys' thoughts?
Well, I think you mentioned Hegseth. I think Hegseth as a colonel is the perfect off-ramp onto a Trump administration because, and Pete, you well know this, anybody who's really served any significant time in the military knows that when that individual puts that first star on, when they get that first star on their shoulder boards, they effectively end their time as a fighting man and become an establishment politician. And in a healthy America, that is a fine thing. But in an era of reform, that is poison. And so you want somebody who is not beholden to the fork and knife club, who is going to reform based on his experience on the ground. That was something that really changed my mind on Trump. I didn't vote for Trump in 2016. I didn't have to because I was in Tennessee and I just abstained because I knew that the state was going to go for him. I was happy when he got elected, but at the time I didn't like the tweets and the things that I found to be quote unquote unpresidential. I've come around since because I realized that electorates get the representation they deserve, and we don't have a Jefferson coming down the pike anytime soon. So, hey, be happy with what you got. But one of the things that Trump did that really changed my mind was one of his first meetings was a closed door meeting with the senior enlisted SOF types in Afghanistan. Like, that was a dream come true for me. That's exactly what I wanted every previous commander in chief to do, because in order to solve the problem, that's who you have to talk to, because Trump as a mogul in New York real estate and construction understands that bullshit filters up. And if you want to really get to the truth of the matter, you got to talk to that welder who understands the problem. And so that was the right take. And I think Hegseth and a lot of the other younger, we haven't seen a president that's brought in, I would say, so young a series of cabinet heads. And I think that that's a refreshing a change.
I want to stay right here with you and I talking about this, because the reality is every general who I've served with is over their career, right? None of these guys were generals in the first Gulf War. And look, we won that thing, but everybody else is like, hey, it's all on the table now. I'm on the table. We lost, you lost. We lost those conflicts. And so the folks who were responsible for provisioning, for training us, they picked the wrong shit. And so we lost. And I'm not saying every general is a bad person. I'm not saying that they, hit their kids or nothing. But when you don't deliver, when the Secretary of Defense who ran the show is like, I wrote the paper on advise and assist, when that shit doesn't work, and then you're SecDef and you say several times, I don't know how many Americans are in that country, nor can I protect them. When you say, I was gone, I don't know, out of my arm, it was broken, and you disappear from office, that's E4 level shit, right? So I am interested in someone else. I'm not comfortable with Pete Hegseth. He does have some things in his closet, but that's more political than anything else. What are the hallmarks of someone who could look? You and I, we know colonels. I've worked with colonels, full colonels, like colonels. Some of them are good, some of them are great, some of them are bad.
Sure.
And I would say ultimately, none of them are prepared to be the Secretary of Defense. But does it matter? Should it be somebody who's not a bureaucrat? Should it be somebody who's not a general? I don't see why not. But again, I want to hear what you have to say, and then we'll bring Will back in.
Well, I think one of Hegseth's points is that it took 30 4-stars or however many 4-stars to win World War II and 200 some odd to lose a 20-year campaign war. I mean, like that's a reasonable assessment of the fact that leadership has failed up in the last, in the post-war era. I'll just put it that way, because the stakes are not as significant. World War II was a war for Western survival largely. And the last 20 years, I worked with people who were dead set on winning the war on terror. And I also encountered people that it was evident that they were indifferent whether we won or lost, because their next position after the Pentagon was already set. They were going to make their money. And in a sense, we kind of saw people literally selling off parts of the country for their own benefit. And I think that that's something that you have to curtail.
Will.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot going on there. I mean, I'm not really qualified to rate the current state of the military brass. Although I'd say we probably do have the late Roman problem where you're running low on centurions. I mean, Rome at its peak had 50,000, I think it was, centurions and watchstanders who were just regular guys, equivalent to maybe sergeants or master sergeants, but they could read and they could set up watches and so on. And those were kind of the elite fighting men, just the citizens. And they had a couple of generals. I mean, the generals were people like Caesar. I mean, they knew what they were doing. And by the end, I mean, they had all these idiotic emperor's sons in, different military offices, the consul of this or that. And they were down to, it was a really low number. I think it was 800 centurions or something like that, people that were actually qualified to go out in the field and organize and do things. And they just basically got conquered by the barbarians. They often would bring in these people to fight for them. And the people that were brought in would realize that the Romans could no longer defend themselves. They would just take big chunks of land and settle there. And that's how a couple of the European countries were set up, in fact, as I recall. But anyway, so it does sound like we have a similar problem now. I mean, if during World War II we had 35 generals or whatever, and today we're not really fighting. I mean, we're fighting very skilled guerrillas and so on, the ragtag Afghan warriors, but we're not really fighting Germany and Japan and Italy. Who's this guy in the comments? But anyway, whatever, it doesn't matter.
I don't know, yeah.
So anyway, we're not really fighting Germany, Japan, Italy, these kind of countries. We've multiplied our command staff by 8. That sounds like something that if I were in charge of defense, I'd want to trim immediately. I'd start sending guys home, holding a bunch of nice retirement ceremonies, giving out the cheapest kind of Rolex watch, and a lot of flowers and all that. And then you get that back to something manageable, which would also probably stop backstabbing competition. I mean, it'd be much easier to have a coordinated leadership strategy. But in terms of, I mean, business leadership, where I do have some pretty strong opinions here, when you talk about Hegseth and these guys, I think they do reflect kind of what Trump's problem is, which Brooks and I have talked about, just lifting weights and so on, which is you're trying to have an outside-the-box administration, but you also want to have very competent people because your political opponents are literally trying to kill you. So how do you combine both of those things? How do you get someone who is ready to do a really good job in these roles, but who's also someone who hasn't been McKinseyized, who doesn't agree with the current ideas of military leadership? And you're probably going to look for younger guys. You're going to look for people who have a mild dark streak. You're going to look for people who are geniuses on the other side. And that's why he's throwing up these guys like Hegseth and RFK. And I think most of them will do pretty good jobs. I don't think, I mean, the only thing that really matters is, the IQ and aggression of the potential leader once they're in the role. I think they'll do pretty well. I mean, it's not like Hegseth is going to be drunk in the Pentagon or anything like that. I'm not sure he really has a drinking problem at all, or has for the past 8 years, having read the records. I think this stuff tends to come out when you rise to a high level. I take sexual assault seriously, but I don't believe that every man who's been nominated on the right for the past 10 years is a rapist. I think it's a pretty effective political strategy that you accuse someone of this kind of shit and you find testimony from an ugly old divorce case or something. Yes, Trump's trying to solve the outside the box problem. I think he's doing pretty well.
And when you hold on to that rape to spring it on them in a hearing, that doesn't doesn't bode well for the credibility. Or if you have a letter like, and now I reveal the secret letter, it's like, well, how long have you held on to this thing for? This crime, you've just concealed it. If they did do it, then get to committing the case in court. Don't do it in front of Congress. That's ridiculous.
Well, the Kavanaugh strategy of public opinion is effective, and that's why they do it repeatedly.
Right.
Yeah, I think though one of the things, especially after, like I wrote the book Hate Crime Hoax, and we've checked attitudes towards some of this stuff over the past 5 years. I think people obviously still, if someone claims they were sexually abused at a frat party or something, people take that very seriously. But when you look at these allegations against powerful people, especially men, even Nikki Haley got accused of like banging her intern like on top in the backseat of her car, and her husband said it didn't happen. Her husband was deployed. Like when you look at everyone who comes forward getting this stuff from 10 years ago, from these sketchy private detective agencies used against them, I think a lot of people are beginning to say, one, I think there's like a 55% chance that's bullshit. And two, if it's not, if that technically crossed the line to some kind of assault, there were more than 4 drinks involved or something, you guys obviously don't care about it for deep ethical reasons. Like the police aren't involved here. This information, as you guys said, has been repressed for years. You're just doing this because you want to remove a political opponent. So people are beginning to take this less and less seriously. We saw this with like Martin Luther King the other day. I mean, the FBI has declassified the Kennedy and King papers, and people are saying like King had a mistress 50 years ago. Like a lot of people at this point are at the level of like, I don't give a shit. Like you shouldn't cheat on your wife, but this is totally irrelevant to his written work.
And given what we've come to learn about the freakiness of the DC set in general, the pearl clutching and the finger wagging, are reduced in significance when you know who's doing it.
Brooks, I want to talk to you a little bit about our general lack of so the people who run DC, elected, executive branch, whatever it is, their general disregard for classified information, right? And so we routinely have these leaks or spies on staff and all these kind of things. And you and I look at our game. If I see that and I'm an adversarial country, I'm going to put people in DC because I know that all I've got to do is get lucky one time, break someone into it. And I say break in like socially. If you get them in there, they won't hold themselves to account. So should we even bother with classifying things for the most part? I mean, look, protect some names, protect some operations, but you and I know we overclassify, right? So should we just get rid of all that and stop playing this ruse of like, we can have TSSCI on our home server? Or I don't know. What are your thoughts on classification? Should we bring Ed Snowden back into the family?
Well, so I think what we've had this whole time, and Pete, you've been subject to the rules of classification, as have I. There's a 2-tiered system, and Hillary Clinton can do as she will and have the copy paste run from Sipper or JWIX to Nipper and or her private cell phone, and that's acceptable. Whereas you and I would be under the prison for such an offense. At the same time, the classification system has been used in the inverse fashion in a way to obfuscate transparency. And I'll give you an example, and this is a very low-level example that will kind of give the listener an idea of how this works at a rudimentary level. One time we were at NTC at Irwin, and we were set up in this administrative building that had civilians running the front desk. And that building had a no weapons policy, but we were, a SEAL team was getting ready to set up in an administrative building as an operations center. So like all the weapons with the blank firing adapters were in huge boxes. And when we tried to come in, they said, you can't come in with weapons. We have a no weapons policy. So the solution, and this wasn't me, but somebody that had access to the top secret marking stickers, just slapped TS stickers on the boxes so the civilians couldn't look in, and we got our way and got through them and did what we had to do. That is how classification is used more often than not to get what you want and to hide it from your adversaries internally. So yeah, I think there's something to the notion of downscaling classification in light of that, I don't think that we should do away with the system, obviously, but I am for more transparency in our information, because an informed electorate is a more sophisticated electorate, is a better electorate, and it gets better representation.
So I want to amplify your story about classification. And so when I was working in Iraq, I had TSSCI, which is the highest level of clearance you can get. And so I submitted for and got my, because I never knew where I was going to be or what I was going to be doing. So I submitted for and got my courier orders. This allows me to carry, everybody listening, I can carry any classified document in theater. So, and if there's a whole procedure for that, do I want that work? No, but if the unit needed it, someone needed to have that and be reliable. So I'm like, I'll take that thing. I was on an American camp, and I was driving, and I ran upon a checkpoint. I am on an American camp, and they said, we have to search your vehicle. And I said, not this vehicle, you don't. And the guy's like, why not? I'm like, well, first off, I've never left the American camp. And second, I have TS courier orders, and you cannot search his vehicle. And that person wasn't sure what to do with that, right? And I'm like, I'm gonna explain what you have to do. You just need to let me go. I'm an American. I can prove that. Here's other IDs. Here's the badges. Here's my 6 badge, which means top secret. And so all you need to do is let me go through. And he wasn't sure. And I'm like, if you want to search this vehicle, you will enter into a very dangerous place for you. If anything, I can require you to drive my vehicle. You will now leave your post. You will drive my vehicle. You are enjoined to help me. It's ridiculous that we have these things, but they're very powerful, these classifications. And if that gets your weapons in to get the job done, that's what you do. But it's courier orders, TSSCI, access, all of these things matter. And that's why when we see something like, and I'm just, a bunch of classified documents in a Corvette or in a bathroom where they aren't supposed to be, we should ask questions. There should be investigations. So secure. So the person is for the audience, because Brooks knows this. There are people called SSOs, the security officer, right? They don't let you break the rule. And when you break the rule, they are now obligated by law to say, hey, the boss just carried her fucking phone into the skiff. I have to report that. So the next call is to the 902nd. Hey, I've just seen a security violation. That is what has to happen. And when that doesn't, our system is broken in a way that I don't know that you can fix. I'm going to let you go on with that, Brooks, and then we'll bring Will back in.
Yeah, again, I think we are at a place, and I'm going to expand this a little bit beyond classification, more to federal code. But like, I've run the data on this, and from our founding to now, the federal code has taken a wave that goes to a point that, and Elon is right about this, if you don't start eliminating statutes, you're going to end up with 3 felonies a day for everybody. And then you just have a 2-tier justice system. Show me the man, I'll show you the crime. At the same time that has happened, government spending and debt, the number of government employees and contractors have all followed the same exact curve. At that same time, the inverse has occurred, the same curve inverted for family size. So think about the notion that I can no longer grow a larger family because my obligation to contribute to the state it takes primacy. And then the purchasing power of the dollar has also followed that curve. So we're in a place where, and I think Trump was kind of the last, this was a very important election. This was our last shot at taking a stab at this and reducing that. But we're at a place where a 2-tier justice system is inevitable, and that includes classification. Hence the box next to the Corvette and the drive, the bleach bit from Hillary, but then Trump gets prosecuted. So even at the higher echelons, it's an in-group, out-group prosecution. And that's the 2-tiered system that it's inevitable unless we start to prune the code.
All right, here's Will. Hey, Will.
What's up, guys? I mean, my perspective on this is coming from a kind of different perspective, which would be almost sort of hacking or banditry. I mean, like, I've always found the classified information thing fascinating because on the one hand, you can go to WikiLeaks or a site like this, just go on to, I mean, Tor used to have the old hidden wiki, and you can find probably about half the information on the governments in the world. I was computer competent enough to do this. I don't really want to see the guys in scuba uniforms coming down my chimney, which is like a 1 in 30 chance if you keep screwing around with this stuff. But I mean, everyone in the sort of elite grad student community knew where this content was. So, I mean, on the one hand, you do feel like it's kind of a joke. Like when you see classified documents clearly being released to the New York Times, that's clearly where they're getting their foreign affairs sources. You can go to Starbucks, set up Tor, go to WikiLeaks and see the source document. Okay, that's level one. But also level two, I mean, you clearly do have to have a system in place to protect the identity of, for example, CIA agents, that sort of thing. To me, it's kind of like the situation around legalizing drugs. Like, yes, it's absolutely true. Welcome to NJ Prepper. It's absolutely true that like some computer hacker at MIT can find most of the classified information that's out there on the internet, and that there are blogs that share it, and that there are people, you know, above the level of my friends at a solid law school or something that are discussing it. But I also think that that's extremely rare, and that in many cases, unless you're a mass media reporter or something like that, you're very unaware of a lot of things the government is doing. It would take even a very skilled person perhaps a day to find the identity of any one agent for one major nation if they wanted to, so on. So is it a perfect system? No. I mean, and of course, I would assume that there are people in the military that take shortcuts and this kind of thing, you know, cars full of documents, etc. But, you know, it's just like you used to be able to buy weed before weed was legal. It's a lot easier to buy weed now that we got rid of the barriers on selling marijuana. Like they're opening a dispensary in Lexington. You just go in, you buy an ounce of weed, and you walk out. I can't imagine that that's going to be good for young men, for example. So, I mean, I favor keeping the classification system and just enforcing the law. This is my response to a lot of things, actually. Like, we got a bunch of perfectly good laws. You know, you can't come into the country illegally. Technically, the response is what used to be called ass in a seat in the Border Patrol. You come in, they whack you a couple times with the truncheon, they put cuffs on you, they put you on a bus. It's called El Conejo, and you go back to Mexico. Now, there have been all sorts of impediments to this. I obviously do not encourage police violence, but there's the idea that you can now falsely file for asylum from Guatemala or some other perfectly stable country, El Salvador post-Bukele. But you can really streamline away 90% of that and just enforce the law. And that's I suppose what I support happening here. The point that Brooks made that I think is the most poignant, because if you ever know a guy in the Navy who violated some idiotic classification rule or something like that, you often do know someone who spent 6 months in the brig or been drummed out of the military. I know people that have been in this situation. A lot of people do. It is annoying to see fucking annoying. It's crazy to see Joe Biden with boxes full of these classified documents relating to military campaigns in his garage. I imagine it's even worse for you guys. Trump wasn't much better. I mean, he had a locked marble wall bathroom, but in Mar-a-Lago, I mean, you can see these pictures on the internet of the boxes. You can zoom in and see some of the documents. So when you do that kind of thing, I think, yeah, there should be some penalty. We shouldn't have the big problem. Last sentence is that we have an anarcho-tyrannical system of government right now. There are people who aren't going to be punished for really any crime. And there are other people, like if you're a lower income white male, you get involved in a street fight in New York City and you accidentally kill a guy with a nose punch, you're going to jail for 10 years. So you have a very broad spectrum of justice that treats people differently. And that's what always causes distrust. So I would focus not on eliminating classification or something like that, or eliminating standard ground laws. I'd focus on equally enforcing the law. I think that would be my response.
Yeah.
Yep.
The thing with the classification, if you do find yourself, you know, in a crossway with the government and you're small, yeah, they're going to smash you to pieces. But and I should say, Donald Trump, all he's got to do is say that's unclassified, and it is. Like, he's got the ultimate authority because he's the boss. But someone has to write that shit down, you know. And so that security officer, that declassification officer, has to keep up with that pace of doing it. And it's just paperwork, right? It's just paperwork to do that. If you're actively trying to sneak things out, if you're actively employing a Chinese spy on your staff and nothing happens, that allows you to become a target.
Or the Sandy Berger fiasco, sneaking into the archives and slipping it out in his sock. So, a point of clarification: Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton were neither commander in chief when the documents in question were pilfered or kept. And that's an important distinction.
Well, neither of them can declassify on their own authority.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. So did Leon Panetta do a good job when he had these jobs that he wasn't really qualified for on paper? I'm doing qualified because I want to hear what you guys think, but, you know, can someone go in and do a good job? Did Mayor Pete do a good job? Even though he didn't have the chops necessarily on paper to go do that job. Did these guys work out, these non-traditional picks?
I think lumping Pete Buttigieg and Leon Panetta and Pete Hegseth into the same bucket might be erroneous. There are outsiders and there are outsiders, and the two aren't the same. I guess it depends on what it is in their background that qualifies them. I see Buttigieg as an abject failure and, frankly, a joke in his role. I see Hegseth as a potential change agent because this isn't a stepping stone for him. He's written on this extensively. He's pointed out problems that he wants to address in the military. And so I view them as different entities. Leon Panetta, I'm a mix on. I'm not a big fan of the agency under his tenure. Fob Chapman is a big deal to me. My best friend was there on that and was killed in that attack. And I think largely their promotion of an analyst to station chief that was just in over her skis was a problem of the Panetta mechanism. And that's not just a Panetta problem. That's a DC problem. And I would call it DEI adjacent.
If the boss came to you and said, Brooks, I want you to be SecDef, would you take the job?
No.
Why?
I'm not positioned to do that. I think Hegseth is positioned to do that. I have left the military and I did some work that was adjacent to it after the fact. I've done some advanced technology research for DHS and DOD, and so I keep a foot in that arena. But I've really transitioned my career away from that, and so. I don't believe I have the experience. I was an enlisted guy and not interested in climbing the ranks of the military. I took the chief exam with a gun to my head 3 times and snowballed each one of those motherfuckers because I had no interest in being a chief because I was not going to serve for a full 20 years. I was a 10-year and out guy. I just wasn't interested in the military career. 9/11 happened. I was going to go fight. That's the tradition from the founders generation. You go fight the war and then you come home and be a productive member of society. Being a chief at Naval Special Warfare would have taken me out of the hinterlands with 12 dusty guys with beards and placed me directly in a talk at Al Assad, with a clean shave and a clean pair of boots, just monitoring all the stuff that I wanted to be involved in. So like my role there was to be on the ground as deep in away from the flagpole as I could be to try to move the needle. And I didn't see a role in Al Assad as something I wanted to do. So if I wasn't willing to be a chief in Al Assad, SecDef's probably out from my resume.
Yeah. What if the boss came to you, Will, and gave you a job? We'll say Secretary of Transportation. You're going to be Mayor Pete's replacement.
No, it's the same thing Brooks said. Like him, I'm a very competent executive. No, I'm totally fucking unqualified to do that. If somebody asked me to be the president of a small college or something, probably. But no, it's just knowing your capabilities. This is a big problem I have with sort of the American lower elite. Everyone sort of thinks that they are prepared to not only be a wolf and a shepherd, like all these spiritual things are the best at everything. People have been told they're 10 since they were 10 years old, all that crap. But people also think that you shoot right for the top when you're trying to build a career. So like all of these guys that come from these elite fields, like Vivek Ramaswamy, Ross Perot, Al Sharpton, just on and on down the board, they all run for president. All 3 of those guys could have made it into Congress easily. I mean, like and I don't necessarily like 2 out of the 3, but I mean, it's just the point is that there's no real reason to aim for positions that you're not really prepared to compete in, to fill out. So like Secretary of Transportation, I mean, I know, a train go vroom, 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 but like, what does that in practice involve? Like, what's your purchasing base? Who's in charge? Who are your suppliers? How do you work with the military? I mean, there are a bunch of things. Like, I assume there's a role that transportation plays in the event of a war, in transshipping troops across the country. What are the roads that are set aside to do that? How do you evacuate those roads? What if the civilians fight, which they would in the South? I mean, the Army beat them. But how do you handle these big, complex questions? I'm not trained in any of those things. So no, I wouldn't do that. And that's the Pete Buttigieg kind of was me or Brooks. I mean, let's be real.
Right.
This is a guy who'd been a city councilman and then a mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And like, okay, that's bigger than Frankfort, Kentucky, but not by much. Like
Right.
your biggest issue is negotiating with Notre Dame, and Notre Dame takes care of a lot of the resource funding in that city, as I understand. So to take over a federal government agency at the cabinet secretary level, I mean, that just strikes me as something you do to build your career. Like, I'm going to be you're not going to stop me from being the king. And I actually think that's a really bad attitude for a leader to have. Like, you don't want to go too far down the servant leader path, but you also don't just want to say, like, although I'm totally unqualified, I'm going to take this position. I don't think Hegseth is that. I mean, like, Hegseth is a different kind of outsider, which is like the hungry young guy who's in the middle of the very elite pack. Where instead of picking the person who's in the front, who has a whole bunch of skeletons, you already know what's wrong with him, so on. You say you're hiring a coach or something, which is a committee I've been on in the university world. You pick like the eighth guy who's coming up, who's younger, who's just as good, and you put him through like an X and O session and so on. I think that's pretty reasonable. Pete Buttigieg is totally different from Hegseth on that. I don't know a lot about Leon Panetta, honestly. I mean, from what I heard, he did a competent job.
And the
Yeah,
Peter
he's an
principle,
incompetent. Yeah,
the Peter principle is something that comes to play here. And for the listener, the Peter principle is the notion that as you are competent in your position and you get promoted, eventually you get to a promotion to a level that is your first level of incompetence. So while you may have been a really good vice president, you turn out to be a terrible executive at the higher levels because it's a different scale, or it's a different the same goes for a manufacturing firm that might be competent at the small business level but just can't scale and isn't competent at doing that. So I think Pete Buttigieg Peter principled out as mayor, frankly. But that's also an issue with regard to Will's point about, the Ross Perot types and the Trump types wanting to go straight to the top. In terms of time value and their previous experience, I mean, really, the president is a chief executive officer of the executive branch. There's a lot of overlap there, but there's a lot of outlying. It's not as straightforward as the business world. So I think a Trump was ill-equipped in his first term, given the fact that he suffered from what I've coined as the Trump problem, which is anybody who has the pedigree to be in your cabinet is of the establishment that you're trying to reform and unseat. So you're essentially hiring miniature opponents to be on your team. That said, after the 4 years in his term and the 4 years to prepare, I kind of liken that to a guy who's stuck his head in the room and gotten a look at the room before clearing it. He's had 4 years to plan on and 4 years of experience of, okay, now I get how DC works. And now I know who I would amass as my fighting force, so to speak, in the forms of the outsiders, and as opposed to picking the John Boltons and the Mike Pompeos that were the bane of his existence the entire first term. So I view Trump this election as the best suited candidate, just given the fact that he's been in the room, he's gotten a look at it, and he can clear it better than anybody else.
I know I'm a bit of a dick when I say this, but and also I'm saying it because the generals that we've seen let us down, have also back channeled against the boss's orders during his first presidency, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if I am somehow by magic I become president, I would look at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. In this case, we're talking about Miley, and I'd say, bring your unit to attention and do an accountability right now. And when he goes up, I'm like, relieved.
Right.
And I would be saying relieved to a lot of dudes. I would have these guys walking, because if you're going to back channel against me, you have to lose your job. If you don't know where all your people are, if you do that to a lieutenant, they would expect to lose their job. Yeah. And I know it's a bigger scale, but if you can't tell me how many contractors are out there, well, then right there, General, that's where your work begins.
And Milley's preemptive,
because I just relieved you. Yeah.
Milley's preemptive pardon is a telling development, and I think the more digging that is done in DOD, the more we're going to find out what he and others did to usurp the former commander-in-chief, now returned.
Yeah. I wanted to bring Will back in, and I'm modulating Will's mic because there's a feedback thing. So I'm just going to bring him back in, and there we go. Hey, Will.
What's up, guys? What's going on?
What are your thoughts on just relieving these generals who undermine the boss's authority? And by the way, who the heck ran the country? I mean, look, I know somebody in my world who has dementia, right? And I wasn't surprised. Matter of fact, I expected this thing to burn up kind of like it did, but years before it was like that. So yeah, I mean, are we okay with a cabal of people? I mean, nobody is, right?
Yeah, well, I think there are two things. They're like, first of all, the question of who's running the country. Like when you talk about Biden, like there are larger number of flag officers in the military, and Biden is technically putting people in these appointments, moving people up ranks. I mean, if you watch Biden, it's obvious he doesn't know. His mind's made out of green cheese. He doesn't know what's going on. So there is that practical element of who is the leadership team. Now, one of the things I will say is because of the growth of the executive branch, the leadership team was probably just Biden's senior staffers, his wife, the cabinet secretaries. We've gotten to a point where we've had multiple non-functional presidents, Roosevelt, Reagan at the end of his term. It's really bipartisan. And you kind of just trot, Uncle Bernie out there and you have him make noises to the camera. And then behind the scenes, you take turns signing the executive orders. So it's terrible, but it's not as though we were almost on the verge of nuclear war and like Panetta or whoever the older black gentleman was that ran the army itself, or one of those guys wouldn't just take the raids. Oh, Lloyd Austin, yeah, of course. If they nukes started launching. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. I had a rotating picture there for a second. Probably should have just professionally kept going. But anyway, so I think that's what was happening. You just had a team behind the scenes, like literally the definition of a cabal, where you've got a mentally defective president and you've got a bunch of people propping him up just by putting a stick in his back and like moving his arms around. I think that's what we saw with Biden. Would I fire generals that don't seem to have a high level of loyalty to the United States and are not needed? And I think a special thing here is not needed. I mean, we don't need 250 one-star and above officers in each branch of the military. I mean, or whatever the equivalents are. Yeah, I would. I think that's, again, one of those things where people keep saying, well, nobody does that. Nobody's done that for decades. But like the Civil Rights Act, for good and ill, has only been around since 1964. Like if we want to say, like, we're going to keep the basic, you can't discriminate against whites or blacks, but we're going to get rid of all affirmative action and all that right now, that's a thing you can do. Like that, this was a 40 or 50 year long experiment that we're now done with. And I think it's the same thing here with a massively overweighted peacetime military. So, yeah, I would. As president, I would make sweeping, unpopular choices that made logical sense. Because from my perspective, having come from the lower working class and seeing virtually every stratum of society, I mean, there's really nothing I wouldn't consider. And I think Trump has that same perspective when he was like, why don't we just take everyone in Gaza and move them out? The Jews and the Arabs have been fighting for 2,000 years. Why don't we pay Egypt to take these people and just end this whole situation? There's the usual left wing screaming of genocide, ethnic cleansing, murder. But it's objectively like a pretty realistic question. Like, why wouldn't a U.S. president, a Jewish leader, and an Arab leader actually just sit down and work that out? Like, what's some land in the region where this group can go where there won't be a war every year? And I think Trump does have that mentality. And I wouldn't be surprised to see command staff shrink pretty significantly under him and Hegseth.
The idea of that's a good point. Like taking Hamas and putting them somewhere, and maybe buying a piece of land and say this is your Palestine now. Make it be nice, and do something else.
I don't think they go for there. There is a particular type of leader for whom grievance is their only option to lead, and Yasser Arafat and Al Sharpton come to mind. Best case scenario, they're running a falafel stand and a barbecue joint. Otherwise, so
Let me jump in because I don't want to go down that road. I want to use this little bit of time we have left here. I want to get into. So my homestead, I'm from California, and I've said for a long time, like everybody here has rights, right? People, fish, agencies, organizations, and so we spend a lot of time in court. And here's what happens with that. We've seen it with the LA fires, and we saw a case of it when Donald Trump had his press conference with Mayor Bass. like in the city of Berkeley, right? Very, very liberal, but they don't like their own government. Their own government hems them up when it comes to things like permits. I'm not saying nobody builds anything in Berkeley, but it is very hard. And so a lot of people who are very liberal look at the city and go, they're fascists, right? And so there's all these problems that happen here where our legal system binds up everything. And so what it does is it calcifies us and it turns us into this weird conservative state where we can't do things like, and we should, like, if anybody should build a train, it should be us. We should be great at that because we love trains and we love the efficiency and all that, but we can't do it because we have all this legal stuff. And so we've become this, in a lot of ways, conservative state. You heard Mayor Bass talk about, oh no, really good. As soon as it's safe, you can move into your home area and start to clean it out. And the boss is like, yeah, tomorrow, tonight, this guy's got a bucket. He's going to go do it. They accept the risk. They're going to do it safe. Let him go do it. And so you hear this conversation going on in real time between in an abundance of caution, like too fucking late, man. Their house is gone. And the other guy is saying, yeah, their house is gone. You need them before it breaks their heart anymore. You need to let them get back to work and fix this stuff. What are your guys' thoughts on the concept of this, all of the, like, how do you manage the protection of rights versus the protection of progress?
My mic is on. Yeah. So when you're talking about, I think the protection of, well, let me clarify. So you're talking a bit about like extreme caution versus the idea that you just have to go on and keep living life, right? With the examples you're using.
Yeah, well, but also like, you want to protect the fish, you want to protect the forest, you want to protect the species, you want to protect, like the Sierra Club at its root doesn't think that they're bad people. Neither do I. But when you get in the way of every single project, like we have dams that are authorized to be built higher, right? But we can't because they get in and all of a sudden you got to go to court. We have dams that are trying to be taken down and they're like, in 10 years and in $50 billion, maybe this tiny little dam in Malibu will come down. And then the surfers raise their hand. Hey, you can't harsh our break. We're going to have to go to court and see the man and see if you get to do that, right? And so these things become impenetrable in the legal system, right? And so you calcify into a conservative, we don't change things kind of thing. So both of those things, I think, are spinning in the same area.
Yeah, I think there's a really obvious answer to this, and I think anyone from a somewhat amoral Roman Stoic to the traditional Christian leaders to John Stuart Mill has basically summed it up in almost identical words. Just the greatest good for the greatest number. Like if you assume every human has a roughly equal value, you do logical things that produce the maximum amount of happiness, money, so on, for the pool of people overall. And it's actually very easy to do this. I mean, like the actuarial profession calculates the worth of a human life at about $10 million. I mean, it sounds brutal, but it's $100,000 salary over a 100-year life. So when you're building a bridge, I mean, is it worth building? Well, that depends. You're going to lose 8 men. Well, we value that at $80 million, but the bridge will bring in $270 million worth of commerce. Yes, we have to build the bridge. We can't stop living. We can't exist in a bridgeless world because risk exists. Now, it's worth noting there's a deeper kind of Thomas Sowell and Hayek element to this, where if you do live in a bridgeless world, people try to swim rivers at fords because they're still going to be aggressive people, and you actually lose 5 or 6 times as many people. But even at just the baseline level of analysis, you can say, like, look, it's worth losing 8 guys to set up this transportation network that's going to operate between the USA and Canada for X number of years. Like, you can coldly, logically, as a leader, say that, and any competent leader has to be able to say that. Just like you have to be able to say charge or execute him or something like that in specific. I mean, I'm not going to counter that too often, like trading or something, but like you have to be able to say that in specific situations that you might well encounter in your life. And I think that's the answer. Like, what we've done in the United States, actually, I think, is create too many rights. There are basic rights. Even I'd agree some natural law exists. You don't wander across a child in a strange city and kill it, But we have we've extended the trump card reality of rights to a bunch of random things. So like the Americans with Disabilities Act now says you have a right to have perfect access as a person with no legs to every building in society. This costs billions of dollars every time someone tries to build. It's awkward to say, but it's one of the main 3 reasons for the housing shortage. And this just goes on and on. Like the Endangered Species Act gives animals rights. Animals, they're very ill-suited to survive, by the way. Humans have only made about half of them endangered. basic cats and coyotes and shit have done in the rest of these useless beasties. But so very often we do stop dams that would irrigate an entire plain and feed 1 million hungry people in the USA and Mexico, because you find some damn type of fish swimming around the intake valve and it's a slightly different color from the same kind of fish downriver. Look up snail darter, a peak snail darter. I'm kind of rambling here. What would I do? I would prioritize the greatest good for the greatest number. So, I mean, if the negative in one case is 3 snail darters killed and the positive is 1 million people fed, I don't really even think that's a case. I think it's absurd that we've had this debate. The reason we had this debate is that we created the Trump card, the right. So the president or the Speaker of the House, whoever can take the Trump card away, needs to pull it out of the suite so we can go back to having a real debate. Pull it out of the suit.
If you're a representative in California or a senator, state or federal style, and you just had this disaster in your district or adjacent, that fire could have happened in Orange County, could happen in San Diego. We did have a fire in San Diego County. And you're not talking about how do we meet a standard for the insurance companies to come back and give us fire insurance. I don't think that you're doing your job either. I mean, this is a real problem. So there's things like there's fire retardant polymers that you can put on the outside of your house. You can require a certain cutback. And when you do these things, the insurance companies will come back. But I don't hear anybody having that conversation, not even Donald Trump.
Well, so, I would push back on the notion of Karen Bass and the California policies as conservative as much as I would call them authoritarian. Regarding the question you posed to Will, the question that the Thomas Sowell quote that I have right here states, the most basic question is not what is best, but who should decide what is best. And, the greatest good for the most people is a very difficult thing to navigate at the scale of 350 million people. I tend to favor the federalist experiment in which we delegate most of these issues to the lower levels in order to isolate misery as a consequence of failure. When we fail at the federal level, misery abounds. But the California fire issue has been a long-standing issue with regard to not clearing out the brush, not doing controlled burns. The water sources in question. Trump turning on the water is, I think a good thing, but this is a long-standing California problem that California has never solved. And then regarding the number of new rights as a phenomenon that Will poses as a pathology, I would agree with that. But I would submit that we had an initial Bill of Rights that were bolstered by responsibility. I mean, the original Bill of Rights is there as a basic treatise, and then we got baited and switched in the New Deal era with other concepts like freedom from want. Don't you want freedom from want? And when you introduce all of these new quote unquote rights, what happens is the original rights become degraded, and further responsibility in pursuit of those rights is all but non-existent at this point. So reintroducing responsibility in the way figures like Jordan Peterson and others have done, especially with regard to young men, I think is an important a feature in moving forward in order to buffer the advantage or the notion of having unlimited rights. Every right comes with a responsibility, and if you're not willing to toe that, then good luck. As a society, good luck.
This has been a jaunty hour. I mean, I can't believe it was that fast. So I want to have you guys help me wrap this thing up. So I guess, Brooks, just give me whatever your final thoughts are. It can be freestyle, whatever you want, but let's talk about that and then we'll wrap this thing up after Will goes. And by the way, thanks, man, for coming on. I don't get to see you enough, and it's always great hearing you talk.
Oh, man, I love coming on, and thanks for having me. We started with the Trump phenomenon. I think it's reasonable to close that out in looking forward to what we're going to see the next 2 years and then likely the next 4 years. I am optimistic, but I think we're teetering on the line here in the Roman sense. And so we'll see what happens. I think we'll see if Tulsi and RFK and who's the other one? Who's up on the dock? No, Hegseth's confirmed.
Kash Patel.
Kash Patel. Yeah, I think because a guy like Kash Patel is an integral player inside. So he knows where the bodies are buried. He knows who's done what. I want to see that develop, and so I'm excited to see that. I think it's a positive development.
And when you have dudes like Peter Strzok, fellow counterintelligence agent, and when they're clearly political, and I know people in the FBI are like, we don't, that's not how we roll.
Right.
When those guys get in charge, you end up with a dude like Kash Patel in charge of your shit,
Right.
And so mind your house. Otherwise, here comes the people in the government. And whether or not you agree with Kash Patel as a pick, or you even agree with the Republicans, this is what happens. There needs to be a pruning of the government. I think we all agree to that. And now we're going to see it. And it's going to hurt a little bit. There's going to be some mistakes, but there's also going to be some positive things as well. Will, bring you back in. Turn this mic on. There you go.
I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Brooks said. I mean, one thing that's kind of important there is the reason for the Trump phenomenon. So, I mean, when he was like, as the FBI, if you keep screwing around, getting involved in politics, and then, the side of the election that your senior guys, if not any of your field agents were probably backing, loses, yeah, you get a Kash Rue coming in there and firing a tenth of the staff. I mean, yeah, that's what happens. Ve victis.
Yeah.
And I think that this explains a lot of the Trump phenomenon in general. So like in 2012, Ben Shapiro makes this point kind of a lot from not really the center right, the right. We've just moved right of that on some of the GOP front. But Ben Shapiro makes this point where he says, in 2012, the Republicans ran Mitt Romney, who is the head of Bain Capital. He's considered one of the best American business executives, just absolutely milquetoast, loves his wife. The guy's a Mormon. I mean, there are a whole series of like intermittent dietary and so on things he won't do, but people started digging up these tiny scandals. Like he once put a dog on the roof of his car in like a blanket padded cage to drive it X number of miles. The dog was fine. He said he had binders full of female executives. Yeah, binders full of women. And he didn't even say that, but it was turned to like, he's got binders full of women. What kind of guy? A harem having Mormon? And it's just all this shit. And like Mitt Romney ended up losing to Barack Obama, who was a much more ruthless campaigner than Mitt Romney was. I mean, Barack Obama was saying things like, Trayvon would look like my son in that year, 2012. And I think a lot of Republicans looked at this and they didn't even hate Barack Obama. They were like, okay, that's what makes you win. So you start proposing more aggressive candidates. I mean, you get DeSantis out there, Ted Cruz out there, Marco Rubio out there, Donald Trump out there, and Trump is able to beat all this other tough opposition. So like when he gets through that field and he's going up against Hillary Clinton, I mean, you do get kind of a bruiser in there. But that's specifically because guys like John McCain and guys like Mitt Romney were treated just like Donald Trump was. Like, if you look at the coverage of John McCain is one of the greatest American war heroes. Like, he refused to leave the quote-unquote Hanoi Hilton until every one of his men got out. The guy was tortured. He's written books on warfare and good governance. But, I mean, you get this Marcus Aurelius type dude, and you just say the same things like, where did his illegitimate black baby come from? Like, that rumor began on the left. So people just had enough of it, and they went with Trump. What's Trump going to do? I mean, if he keeps the tweeting on the toilet kind of bullshit in check and focuses on the building the border wall and there are two sexes and getting rid of affirmative action and all that kind of thing, I mean, he could have a multi-generational impact. He'd be viewed as a Reagan-like figure or more so. And last sentence, this illustrates what conservatives should do. You don't just want to go in and play the game within a growing state. Your response is to get rid of the things that were considered radical, that were forced through by the other side. There's a lot of good stuff on the left. Everyone who's not a domestic abuser is a first wave feminist. I mean, someone pointed out to me that's true, but there's more bullshit. It's like mutation. 95% of it doesn't work. It's just poison. So when you get into a government where you have established affirmative action programs for soldiers and just crazy stuff like that, firemen, you can just get rid of all that. And that should be the goal of a right-wing candidate. Let's see how Trump does.
I want to say one more thing because I can't help it. It's so good to say. We're seeing these guys, Stephen A. Smith, Fetterman, Adams in New York. These guys were saying, hey, we've been told something by the populace here. Like we were wrong. And they're ratcheting back and they're going in a different direction. So we might really see this legacy that you're talking about, Will, of, look, who cares about Republican, Democrat in this case? You see a lot of people who are on the losing side of this election I realize that they have to adjust. Do you guys have any thoughts on that at all? And I mean, to hear Fetterman talk, you'd swear he voted for Donald Trump by the way he speaks about representing his people. And that's a very interesting and unexpected change, I think.
Well, Brooks will probably wrap this up, but I do have actually one quick comment, which is that a big part of this is that nobody ever believed in woke. This is because I do actual surveying. This is something that I see pretty frequently. Like something I bring up, and it's not one of my professional academic papers with Corey Clark or something like that, but it was an astonishing result. I asked on Twitter once with a link to SurveyMonkey, like professionally done, how many of you actually believe that some women have penises? I wanted to ask a question about transgenderism that wasn't like intentionally confusing. Should trans female athletes compete with their preferred gender or their preferred sex type shit? I wanted to just ask, like, do people with big dicks get to go into the girls' locker room? I think I asked 8 or 9 inch penises, actually. It was like an explicit, funny question. And I expected like 30% of people to say yes, because my page is very bro, but it also has like everyone's feminist girlfriend, like Jane is on it, and everyone's wife is on it, and people like the hit of Now used to be on it debating with the guys. But actually, with everyone, including the feminists, like Eva Kuralova and all these prominent feminist writers counted, the actual vote was 98-2. It's something that's been discussed in actual major magazine pieces. And it just struck me, like, as I was looking at this, like, nobody believes this. Like, it's just completely emperor has no clothes. Like, if you ask the real question, like, would you have sex with a trans woman? 98% of people are going to say no. And no hate for those people or anything like that, people living with gender dysphoria, but just like the whole presentation socially is bullshit. This is true for a lot of feminism, by the way. Like, I don't like dominant men. This is true for a lot of Black civil rights stuff. Like, I am oppressed in the affirmative action era. And I think that when people got the chance to just say that, everybody just said it. Like Stephen A. Smith, who's a multi-millionaire from one of the historically Black colleges, I think in an interracial relationship, well-known, good stock investor. He didn't believe any of this horse shit. He just had to say it on the air so he didn't get fired. Like, as a Black male millionaire, the only guy less protected is a white man. So he just went along like, yep, of course, some women have 9-inch dicks. And then you get freed from the ability to do that. And a lot of people are going to say, okay, let's set up policies so we never have to do that again. This was idiotic. This went on for years. This is like being ruled by Puritans.
So what you just touched on, I think, is important, because the majority of people don't believe in woke, but woke is effective operationally. Like, it worked in getting Stephen A. Smith to say the thing to keep his job, and great thinkers on critical theory, Lindsay et al., Hicks, etc. You, Wilfred, and some of the work that we've done with regard to DEI and are doing. The woke phenomenon is effective operationally. It is criticizing something until you control it, calling something racist until you control it, calling something misogynist until you control it. And while I don't think Larry Fink is a neo-Marxist, I think those types that are pushing ESG and DEI recognize an operationally successful model when they see it. And if it can be the battering ram that gets them more of what they want, then why not use it? It's Menshevik Bolshevik, right? I'm not ideologically tied to this, but if this is what gets me to the throne, so be it.
I love it. Well, I'm going to wrap this up for everybody. Put myself in the big window here. All right. So that's Brooks. He's awesome. He's on X. You can find him. Just type in Brooks Crenshaw. And
at
that's
Crenshaw
Actual.
Actual.
Right there. Say it again.
At Crenshaw Actual, and the Datalist thread on Substack.
Datalist thread on Substack. And then, Will, if you would promote your stuff, if I can get your mic to turn on. There it goes.
Sure, yeah. I'm Will Reilly. I'm the author of Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. You can find me. The easiest way to find me is just searching my name, which is Wilfred Reilly. It's WILFREDREILLY. And you'll find my Twitter or X. You'll find my mini website, Facebook page, multiple books, that kind of thing. So definitely hit a brother up.
Hit a brother up. All right. Let me wrap this up.